Nobody in Cypress Bend, Texas thought much of it that first summer when 11-year-old Sawyer Prescott started sprinting the same half-mile stretch of fence line along his family's Canyon Edge property every single morning before breakfast, timing himself with an old stopwatch his grandfather had given him and recording each run in a small notebook he kept tucked in his back pocket. Sawyer had been diagnosed with ADHD the previous year, and his parents, after a difficult stretch of trial and error finding routines that actually helped rather than frustrated him, had landed, almost by accident, on the morning sprint as something that seemed to genuinely settle him before the rest of his day began. Most of Cypress Bend, on the rare occasions anyone mentioned it, assumed the routine was exactly what it looked like from the outside, a restless kid burning off energy before school, useful for him personally but not something that had anything to do with the rest of the community. Nobody guessed that Sawyer's careful, repetitive attention to that exact stretch of ground, morning after morning for an entire summer, would end up giving his family and 3 neighboring ranches critical warning before a flash flood that Texas Hill Country's official alert system caught considerably too late. If stories about finding real strength in the way your own mind works, and the surprising value of a routine nobody else understood, matter to you, this is exactly the kind of story we tell every week. Go ahead and hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And if this story moves you, tap that like button before you go. It genuinely helps this small channel find the people who care about stories like Sawyer's. Now let's find out what Sawyer's morning sprints were really telling him, and why it mattered more than anyone in Cypress Bend understood until the water came. Cypress Bend sits in the Texas Hill Country, canyon-cut ranchland where a deceptively calm, dry landscape could turn genuinely dangerous within hours when heavy rain fell upstream in the watershed, even on days when Cypress Bend itself saw barely a drop. The region's thin limestone soil shed water fast rather than absorbing it, funneling runoff through narrow canyon drainages that could rise from a trickle to a genuine flash flood with startling speed, a well-known regional hazard that longtime residents respected but that, given how rarely any single property actually experienced a serious flood event, most families didn't think about constantly. Sawyer's family had run cattle on their 500-acre property along Cypress Bend's canyon rim for 3 generations, and Sawyer himself had struggled, through his early elementary years, with exactly the kind of restless, difficult-to-channel energy that had eventually led to his ADHD diagnosis at 10. A diagnosis that came with real relief for his parents, Hank and Marisol Prescott, who'd spent years genuinely uncertain how to help their son manage a level of physical and mental restlessness that made traditional structure, sitting still for schoolwork, following multi-step instructions calmly, exhausting for him in ways that weren't simply about discipline or effort. The morning sprint routine started, as far as Marisol could piece together, from a suggestion Sawyer's grandfather, Walt Prescott, offered almost casually that first summer after the diagnosis. Walt, who'd run the ranch himself for decades before handing primary operations to Hank, had noticed that Sawyer seemed calmer, more able to settle into schoolwork and chores, on mornings when he'd already burned off real physical energy beforehand. He suggested Sawyer try running the fence line along the canyon rim each morning before breakfast, gave him an old stopwatch that had belonged to Walt's own father, and told him, half-joking, that if he was going to run the same stretch every day anyway, he might as well time himself and see if he could beat his own record. Sawyer took to the suggestion with a level of consistency that surprised his parents considerably more than they expected of a routine they'd offered mostly as one more experimental strategy among many. He ran the same half-mile stretch every single morning that entire summer, rain or shine, timing himself carefully and recording each run's time in a notebook, developing, without anyone quite planning it, an intimate, repeated physical familiarity with that exact quarter-mile of ground that went considerably beyond simply knowing the path visually. His mother noticed that Sawyer had started mentioning small details about the route that struck her as unusually specific for a child mostly focused on his running time, which sections felt different underfoot after rain, where the ground stayed spongy longer than other stretches, small variations in footing that Sawyer, running the identical path every single day with genuinely focused attention, had absorbed into a kind of physical memory most people never developed for any piece of ground, since most people never covered the same half-mile with that much repeated, attentive consistency. His cousin Dutch, visiting from Austin for 2 weeks that July, found the morning ritual mildly bewildering. "You run the same fence line every single day," Dutch said, more statement than question, watching Sawyer lace up his shoes before dawn one morning. "Doesn't that get boring?" Sawyer explained, with the straightforward honesty that came naturally to him, that he liked knowing exactly what to expect, that the sameness was part of what made the routine work for him, and that he'd actually started noticing the ground telling him things, which parts stayed wet longest, which sections dried out fastest, small details Dutch had never thought to consider about a stretch of fence line he'd walked past without much attention his entire visit. Word of Sawyer's routine moved through Cypress Bend's small ranching community the way most things did, through the feed store and casual conversation among neighbors who'd known the Prescott family for generations. Regina Voss, who ran the adjoining property along the same canyon rim, mentioned to another rancher that the Prescott boy ran the fence line every morning like clockwork, rain or shine. A comment delivered with genuine fondness for a kid finding his own way to manage his energy, but with the settled assumption, shared by most of Cypress Bend, that the habit was purely personal, useful for Sawyer's own well-being, but not something carrying any broader practical value. The situation that mattered arrived in early August, during a stretch of days when Cypress Bend itself saw only light, unremarkable rain, nothing that struck anyone locally as cause for particular concern. What nobody in Cypress Bend fully appreciated, except in the vague, background way longtime hill country residents generally understood the region's flash flood risk, was that a considerably heavier storm system had stalled for nearly 6 hours over the watershed's upper drainage basin, roughly 15 miles upstream, dropping well over the day's forecast rainfall in an area that fed directly into the canyon system running past the Prescott property. Sawyer ran his usual route that morning, the same half-mile he'd covered every single day for nearly 2 months, and noticed something that struck him as genuinely wrong almost immediately. A section of ground roughly a third of the way along his route, a stretch that had stayed reliably dry through even the wettest mornings that entire summer, felt soft and spongy underfoot in a way he'd never once experienced there before, despite Cypress Bend itself having seen only light rain overnight. He finished his run and told his father directly, with the same specific, detailed description he'd absorbed through 2 months of repeated attention to that exact ground. "The dry patch by the old oak is wet," Sawyer said. "It's never wet there. Even after real rain, that part stays dry." Hank, who'd learned over the previous year to take his son's careful, specific observations seriously rather than dismissing them as unfocused chatter, walked out to check the spot himself and found Sawyer's description accurate. Ground that should have been among the driest on the entire property sitting notably saturated despite minimal local rainfall. Hank, connecting his son's observation to what he knew, in the general background way most longtime hill country ranchers did, about upstream rainfall sometimes driving flash flood risk even on locally dry days, called the county's emergency management line that same morning to ask whether any flood advisories were in effect for the watershed. The dispatcher confirmed that a flash flood watch had, in fact, just been issued minutes earlier for the broader drainage basin, based on rainfall reports from upstream monitoring stations, information that hadn't yet reached any public alert Hank or his neighbors had seen. Hank didn't wait for further confirmation. He moved cattle away from the canyon's lower pasture immediately and called Regina Voss and 2 other neighboring families along the same drainage, relaying both the county's flash flood watch and, more specifically, Sawyer's own ground-level observation about the unusual saturation pattern, urging everyone to move livestock and equipment away from low-lying areas well ahead of any visible sign of rising water. The flash flood hit that canyon drainage roughly 90 minutes later, water rising with the characteristic speed hill country flash floods were known for, surging through the lower pasture and canyon bottom with enough force to have posed serious danger to any cattle or equipment left in its path. Every property Hank had reached that morning had already cleared livestock from the affected low ground, a margin that, according to the county's own after-action assessment, mattered considerably given how little formal warning time the public alert system had actually provided before water levels became genuinely dangerous. Regina Voss came by the Prescott property 2 days later, once the water had receded and the full scope of what had been avoided became clearer. "Your boy felt that flood coming through his own 2 feet before the county even knew to warn us," she said, standing at the edge of the canyon rim with an expression considerably more serious than the fond amusement she'd shown that July. Hank didn't disagree, and told her plainly that he intended to start paying much closer attention to whatever Sawyer noticed on his morning runs going forward. By the following summer, Hank had started walking a portion of Sawyer's route with him most mornings, not out of any doubt in his son's ability but out of genuine interest in learning to notice at least some of what Sawyer had absorbed through an entire summer of careful, repeated attention. Sawyer, for his part, kept running the same fence line every single morning, stopwatch in hand, The routine that had started as one strategy among many for managing his own restless energy having become, without him ever intending it, something his whole family now took considerably more seriously. Sawyer never made much of what happened that August. When people asked how he'd known the ground felt wrong, he usually gave some version of the same simple answer. He hadn't known anything about flash floods or watersheds. He'd just run that same stretch of ground so many times that he knew exactly how it was supposed to feel, and when it didn't feel that way anymore, he couldn't quite ignore it, the same way he'd never been able to ignore much of anything once he noticed it. There is a particular kind of attention that some minds build not despite restlessness but because of it, a need for exact repetition and physical engagement that, given the right routine, can turn into genuinely rare expertise. Sawyer Prescott hadn't set out to warn 3 ranches about a flash flood or prove anything about how his own mind worked. He'd simply needed to run the same ground every single morning to feel settled, and in doing that faithfully, for reasons that had nothing to do with watching for danger, he learned that stretch of earth well enough to notice, immediately, the one morning it didn't feel like itself anymore.